My name is Ellie Dudley. I'm the legal affairs correspondent with The Australian, and I'm joined by Claire Harvey, the editorial director of The Australian and the host of The Australian's daily podcast, The Front. We today have spent the day in the New South Wales Supreme Court of Appeal listening to the appeal of, or the first day of hearings in an appeal for Chris Dawson, who in October 2022 was convicted for murdering his wife, Lynette Simms. Claire, you've been covering this case for goodness knows how long now, years and years. What did we hear today? What did we learn today from Chris Dawson's appeal?
Well, Chris Dawson, who has fought every step of this legal process all the way, he went to the High Court to try and stop the trial happening in the first place. He argued that he couldn't get a fair trial because of the publicity surrounding The Australian's worldwide smash hit podcast, The Teacher's Pet, which was where the allegation of murder against him was first publicly aired. Today, Chris is arguing that he didn't get a fair trial in the murder trial because Justice Ian Harrison of the Supreme Court, according to Chris, made too much of Chris's lies. So Justice Harrison found that because Chris Dawson had lied about some things, like, for example, receiving a phone call from his wife on the day after she disappeared, that Chris was guilty of murder. Remember, this is an entirely circumstantial case. There's no body, there's no DNA evidence, there's no other contemporaneous evidence that might show where Lynn went that day. Dawson also says that if he had been charged in 1982 when Lynn disappeared, he could have brought evidence that would have helped clear him. He calls that a significant forensic disadvantage, which means that he just hasn't had the opportunity to prove his guilt. Of course, in a criminal case, he doesn't have to prove anything. It was on the Crown to prove that he was guilty, and they did in the eyes of Justice Ian Harrison. So it's a big hearing. It's going to go for 3 days.
Yeah.
3 judges who seemed very prepared, didn't they?
They did seem very prepared. I thought it was interesting because they were coming back at Belinda Rigg, who is the senior public defender who is defending Chris Dawson in this appeal, representing Chris Dawson in this appeal. They kept coming back at her with questions. So, for example, when Ms Rigg was talking about this significant forensic disadvantage that Chris Dawson has experienced given the 40-year gap in between the murder occurring and the trial, they were saying things like, well, if Mr Dawson was advantaged because of a lack of, forensic evidence, then surely the Crown were also disadvantaged because that same lack of forensic evidence. They also had that 40-year gap that they were battling an uphill battle against. So Ms Rigg sort of had it out for her today. She definitely got a lot of questions from the bench. We heard some witnesses come up that we had heard during the criminal trial, people like the trolley boy that Chris Dawson confronted, people who were working at the pool where Chris Dawson worked part-time as a lifeguard. What did we hear about the details of the case and the parts of the case that Chris Dawson is hoping to appeal? This
all goes to the significant forensic disadvantage. So, for example, there was a lot of discussion about some eyewitnesses who alleged that they saw Lynn Dawson after she disappeared. There were a number of people who said that they'd seen Lynn over various years after her disappearance. Belinda Rigg said the most significant one of those was a woman called Sue Butlin, who claimed that she saw Lynn Dawson at a fruit barn, a roadside fruit barn, that she recognised Lynn, that she went up to her or tried to approach her, and that Lynn got in the car and drove away. Justice Ian Harrison dismissed the significance of that finding. He said Lynn Dawson didn't drive for a start, so it was very unlikely to be her, that it was a very fleeting glimpse of her by Sue Butlin, and of course that Sue Butlin herself was dead at the time of the murder trial, so she was not able to give evidence. Her husband, who was a friend of Chris Dawson, gave evidence that this is what Sue Butlin had told him before she died. So Belinda Rigg is saying, yes, there are inconsistencies there, perhaps this may not have been true, but she kept coming back to the point that Chris Dawson didn't get the chance to put that before the judge, to have Sue Butlin in the witness box being cross-examined, to have all that ventilated. The trolley boy is one of the great aspects of this case. So this was a 16-year-old boy who in the early 1980s, when he was the same age as the Dawson family's babysitter, a girl who can only be identified as JC, she went on to become Chris Dawson's second wife. And in fact, Justice Harrison found that Chris Dawson was motivated by his desire to have a relationship with JC to kill Lynn. the trolley boy was interested in JC. He was a schoolboy, he knew her, and he described in the murder trial this terrifying moment where Chris Dawson confronted him in the basement car park of Coles, where he worked, pushed him up against the wall and said basically words to the effect, "Stay away from her." Belinda Rigg raised the trolley boy incident today and said Chris Dawson really wasn't given a fair hearing. He had said in an intercepted phone call that the reason he'd pushed the trolley boy up against the wall was that he had heard that he'd been saying offensive things about the babysitter. So not that he was possessive or jealous or had a sexual interest in her at that time, but that he was trying to, defend her from a nasty boy. So we're seeing some very fine distinctions in evidence and memory that Belinda Rigg is honing in on.
The other thing that's sort of been a big question in all of this, and was such a huge question in the criminal trial, is why would a loving mum who had 2 kids at home, why would she just disappear and leave them, right? And today Belinda Rigg tried to put forth this argument of, well, Lynette Simms knew that Chris Dawson was a devoted father, that he would take care of the kids and change their nappies, and I think at one point referred to him as admirably take care of the kids when she would sit on a picnic blanket chatting with the other women. And so Belinda Rigg put forward this argument that Lynette Simms would have happily left her children in the care of their father, who was a devoted father to his kids. The other thing that she put forward was these claims that Lynette Simms was very unhappy, very mentally unstable in the weeks before she disappeared, that they were having severe marital problems, and that could have been a motivator for her to leave her husband and kids and completely disappear.
In a very similar way, this argument about Lynn Dawson being prepared to leave the family home is that the reason that she wanted to leave was that Chris was being unfaithful, that she was miserable, that Chris was awful to her. So in both the murder trial and this appeal, counsel for Chris Dawson have to try and somehow balance the fact that he was a terrible husband, he was being unfaithful, he subsequently married the teenage babysitter who he moved into the home shortly after Lynn left. And in his argument, that's why Lynn abandoned the home. He didn't kill her, she just fled because she was in despair. What did you think of Chris Dawson when you saw him on the screen in court?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because you see him sitting in his tiny little cell, and you remember while we're all sort of, going on with our lives, he's living out life in prison, having been convicted and will likely die in prison, considering not only the length of his sentence, but the no body, no parole laws, Lynn's law, that was introduced as a result of this case. He seemed very stern. He didn't move much. He didn't, at one point, it looked like he had frozen on the screen there because he was so just frozen, basically. He at one point talked to verify that he could hear the court and see the court, but besides that he was very quiet and basically just another observer in the courtroom.
Last time we saw Chris Dawson, he was on a video link from Long Bay Prison. That was when he was on trial for another charge that he was convicted of, which was the carnal knowledge of this young woman when he was her teacher and she was aged just 16. He's been moved, hasn't he? He's at a new prison now.
Yes, he's at a prison up in Grafton, so up on the mid-New South Wales coast, where he will remain until he dies. Now, we've got 2 more days of this hearing, Claire, tomorrow and Wednesday, and then ultimately these 3 judges will have to make a judgment. We'll be keeping everybody well updated, both across the front and across our live blogs on the Australian's website, so take a look there to get the full coverage. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.